Okay. We do have a number of questions, some of people who are in the audience and some have come in from affiliates. I was going to call Phil McGarry from the RMT with the first question, and I think once Phil asks his question, if you want to direct it to somebody and then allow other people to come in, or if you're just happy for it to be selected up here as the answers first.
Thanks very much, Chair. Well, it comes as no surprise to you that the question that I have is related to transport because I'm a former RMT official. Huh? All right. As I said, it would be remiss of me not to raise a question, or at least two questions if I may. Both of them are interrelated. I'm a former RMT official, and for my sins, I'm also chair of the People's Assembly here in Scotland. I'm very proud of that fact and privileged to do so. But, Chair, perhaps I could beg your indulgence. The question is in two parts, and it's not personal. Please don't think it is. But firstly, I want to direct my question to the Labour candidate, Ian Davidson. I'm totally dismayed and disappointed to read Labour's manifesto. Yes, there's some good points in it, but I would argue it's not good enough. I think a window of opportunity has been missed for Labour not to give some sort of commitment to bring the railways back into public ownership and renationalise it. Those of you who might have saw the BBC Two programme at 9 o'clock last night actually come up with the answer. It talked about the fragmentation of the services, high fares that people are expected to pay, and overcrowding of trains. Now, that, in my view, is a missed opportunity, as I said, because 73% of the general public support renationalisation of the railways. Now, the other bit is, of course, the question of the performance of the SNP government. Some years ago, the SNP favoured public ownership, and yet that has not now occurred. Because what they've done, they went down the franchising route, gave the contract to Abellio.
Phil,
let me finish, please, if you don't mind. Gave the contract to Abellio, and of course are now participating in a franchising exercise for the ferry services. What's happening to the ethos of public ownership regarding the SNP? And perhaps Chris will be able to answer that. Because at the end of the day, I'm so dismayed and confused of people saying one thing and doing another.
Okay, thank you. I think we can
tell me in 3 minutes, by the way, you should have.
I was expecting you to take 3 seconds. Ian, I think that was directed in the first instance to yourself and to Chris, and then I'll give other folk a chance to come in.
Well, could I say, first of all, that I'm very happy to be supported in my election campaign in Glasgow South West by the RMT. And the RMT is a union which is not affiliated to the Labour Party, but they're choosing to support me and they're supporting my campaign financially. In answer to the point about the manifesto is no perfect. I mean, I don't think any political party's manifesto has ever been perfect. But I think there's more content. I think there's more content in the Labour Party's manifesto this time. There's a more radical manifesto now than there has been for a generation. Let's be clear about the question of public ownership. In the leaflet that I've put out, copies of which are available at the back, I have said that one of the commitments is public control of the railways, power in the hands of the people, not multinationals or foreign governments. We have said that we wouldn't have re-tendered the East Coast rail line. We have also said that the SNP had no need, in our view, to re-tender either the sleeper service to Scotland or the ScotRail contract, because we have said that in the context of the Smith Agreement, we're going to pass those powers to the Scottish Government, which would then allow them to have a public sector operator for both of those, and all they needed to do was roll the contract over, and RMT endorsed Labour's position. But the Scottish Government, shamefully in my view, sped ahead and agreed to tender it both to Serco ante abellio. Now, that's our commitment in terms of public ownership. I understand the point about nationalisation, but there's more than one way of skinning a cat. And what you can do when the contracts come up for retendering, you make sure that there's a public sector operator wins those contracts, in which case you end up avoiding having to pay millions in compensation. That's the way to do it, and that's Labour's position and my position, and thank you very much for the support that I'm getting from the RMT.
Okay, Phil, probably to take you through the history as I understand it, you're correct to say that the SNP position has been, in terms of railways, that a public sector trust should be able to apply. My understanding of the law is that it can't do that yet because of the Railways Act 1993, and we have sought the devolving of that Railways Act when we're seeking additional powers. Now, if we get those powers, there is a break in the existing contract for that to then go to a retendering process so that a public sector trust may be able to do that. That's my understanding of the position. In terms of ferries, not au fait with that, but I understand it again is EU procurement, but I will get back to you on that because, to be honest, I've missed some of that in terms of ferries, so I do apologise.
Can I bring in Moira at the end here, please?
Okay, well, our position is to have put the railways back into public ownership. Similar to Mr Davidson said, we would do it contract by contract as they come up. We just think that transport should be a service. It shouldn't be run as a profit, and it should be run in order to get people around, preferably without having to use private car transport. We're also thinking about air quality. We'd like to re-regulate the buses as well. I think that was an absolutely mad idea to privatise the buses. So I know the question wasn't asked, but it's about transport, so we'd like to re-regulate the buses too and have electric fuel cell buses so that we don't have the awful air quality which we do have in Glasgow just now and across Scotland. So it's yes to public ownership as far as we're concerned.
The majority of the public want public ownership of the railways, and that doesn't mean the state having to bid alongside private companies. The state should be the only provider of transport. And with regards to the EU competition procurement rules, well, that's the EU's whole agenda is privatisation across the Eurozone, so perhaps we should reconsider our position on the European Union.
Trade Unions and Socialist Coalition is a coalition of socialist parties and the RMT, so with it, I don't know if that would also mean that I'm also a candidate backed by the RMT on the platform, but you can interpret that as you wish. Partly the mood amongst trade unions is to look for alternatives to vote for and to represent them in Parliament and get their voice heard really comes down to a lot of the issues around your question about who controls our services, transport being key. There is no reason why we follow public opinion and other. They're always chasing public opinion, except when it seems to be redressing the balance. So TUSC would certainly be for a renationalisation, rail, buses, ferries, integrated public transport system, low pollution. It is more efficient. The myth of the private sector being anywhere efficient is an absolute lie that is just increasing further damage on working-class people and populations, and we would be supporting renationalisation without compensation.
Our policy is that we do think that public sector organisations should be allowed to bid alongside private and for other contracts, third sector organisations for contracts. Personally, I don't support privatisation because I think if you look over the record of the last 150, 200 years, there's a clear correlation between private ownership and the commercial aspect of the railways and passenger journeys, more efficient transport. And that's my personal view, but our party view is that we would allow and want to enable public sector organisations to bid. Moira mentioned about bus transport. I think this is a really key thing. The Labour Party at the moment in the Scottish Parliament are putting forward a private members bill, Ian Gray, I think, about re-regulation of buses. Now, the Liberal Democrats aren't known for their support of regulation, but we do support this and measures outlined in this bill. For example, a few reasons. First of all, the disparity between the massive companies such as First Bus, sort of skimming off the really commercialised routes in Glasgow, and you've got small buses like McGill's or even voluntary-run buses, they just can't compete with those contracts. So McGill's can't offer disabled transport because they don't have enough money through the contracts, and so it's a really unfair system. So I would like to see a more light-touch regulation so that there's a fairer playing field between the bus companies. So I would hope that the SNP would change their current opposition to Labour's proposed bill on regulation of buses and support it eventually.
Well, it wouldn't surprise Phil what I'm going to say, because the Scottish Socialist Party produced a pamphlet on taking the railways back into public ownership in conjunction with the RMT when the union was affiliated to the Scottish Socialist Party. And we believe privatisation has been a monumental disaster. For example, the subsidies to private companies is 6 times the level of what was invested by the state in a publicly owned railway system. That tells its own story. And I therefore unequivocally would argue for bringing it back into public ownership, not the old style dictatorial nationalisation actually, but with democratic control of not just the railways, but also buses, ferries, the underground, etc., in an integrated transport system, which we have, as I said in passing, have argued should be free at the point of use. And we think that public investment in that would tackle both poverty and pollution. And we're proud to argue for that. In terms of bringing it back, I think Labour might be raising stuff in Ian's material at the minute about renationalisation of the railways, but that's 13 years in Labour government to reverse what the Tories had done and didn't. And I think that has to be answered, because it just doesn't stand up to examination. And likewise, in terms of ScotRail, etc., the East Coast, I think that if we're going to be stronger for Scotland, or in our case, stand up for the Scottish working class, we have to stand up to the bureaucrats of Europe, the European Union, when it comes to it, and say we will carry out what we think is in the interests of the Scottish people, the working class majority people of Scotland, and not what the law dictates from on high, from Brussels or somewhere else. And therefore I think it was a terrible missed opportunity to bring ScotRail into public ownership, and I don't think it's an accident, because the mainstream parties, unfortunately, still are wedded to the idea that private is good, public is bad, and sometimes they get funded as a result, with people like Brian Souter involved in privatisation. I think we need instead to argue for public ownership, democratic control, and then build on that with a free transport system.
Okay, Job. Ian Davidson, the outgoing Labour MP, referring to the Labour manifesto, said no manifesto is perfect. Well, the Conservative and Unionist manifesto is perfect, and I would urge you all to read it. On the transport issue, obviously, you would not be surprised to know that I am against nationalisation, and I believe that I think that we need to run the transport system more efficiently and more effectively. Thank you.
Okay, Phil, you've got plenty of food for thought there. You know who's on centre.